Welcome. Thank you very, very much for taking the time today. The objective of this session here is to just give you some very basic understanding of pivot tables from Excel and how you can take advantage of them, and really kind of break down the fact that pivot tables are not a scary tool set or feature within Excel. They don't require a lot of knowledge. I believe that anybody can be successful in using and or creating their own pivot tables for sure. We certainly want to give you enough information that then helps kind of pique your interest to go further and ultimately build your confidence that, hey, this is not that hard. This is something that I can do, and it's going to make my job a lot easier, and I'm going to be able to provide that much more value to my clients and the folks that I work with. So that's really what we're trying to achieve in this session here. What I'll do is I'll go through just a couple of slides just to kind of help level set some of the definitions and the use cases. And then what we'll do is I'll actually go to Excel and demonstrate how you can take a block of information, a block of data, and essentially create a pivot table and then use it to help summarize the information within. So with that, going to slide number 2. The way I describe a pivot table is essentially it's taking a two-dimensional, very flat piece of information, i.e. a spreadsheet, and allowing you to turn that into a very, very dynamic and multi-dimensional tool, if you will. The pivot table is really very, very useful for consolidating or summarizing and synthesizing both a very little amount of information and then also vast amounts of information. So it does a great job of scaling across, again, some really fairly bite-sized pieces of information that may be kind of tricky to summarize, or there's enough attributes in there that it's nice to be able to slice and dice, if you will. And then, yeah, clearly it can scale to huge amounts of information. And lastly, the gist of why this becomes so powerful is it really helps to provide views that are digestible, that are easy to read, they're easy to understand, kind of get your arms around, and kind of ultimately make better business decisions. And it also helps to mitigate some additional work that you may otherwise have to do if you don't use a pivot table, if you're trying to tabulate a number of different things. And so it kind of helps to reduce or mitigate a number of manual efforts that sometimes you'd go through otherwise. So moving to slide number 3 here, there's a myth or a hypothesis around the fact that, pivot tables are really for power users, aren't they? And I guess my answer to that is sure. I guess they're used, they can be used by power users, but I also believe that they're easy and anyone can use or create pivot tables, and therefore anyone can become a power user. And so that's really what we're hoping to achieve in this short session, is to give you enough information for you to kind of get off and running. Now, here are some basic steps, 1 through 4, and by following these steps, you can take a block of information, create a pivot table, and begin to effectively play with your information and determine the views that you like to create and what's going to be most helpful for your particular case or use case. I'm not going to go through this particular slide. I'll use it as a piece of reference, or you can refer to it on your own, because I'm actually going to go through the steps here as I move over to my Excel workbook. So in this example, what I've done is I've just created a very, very simple block of information. It's just this little grouping of attributes, if you will. And what we're going to do is we're going to pretend that this information relates to people who have registered for an upcoming event. Okay, so imagine you're managing this event and your client is asking, okay, well, how many registrations have we gotten, and what's the partner profile, and who's missing, and so forth and so on. By just using or looking at this flat piece of spreadsheet, it'll take you a little while to kind of cut through there and weed out and determine who's coming, who's registered, who hasn't registered, and where are they from, what partner, what organization, and so forth and so on. So very, very simply, the first step is to simply highlight the block of information that you want to create your pivot table from. The next step is to simply hit the insert menu, and then you'll see this little option here that says pivot tables. And in this case, and the demos within are going to select from a table range as the option. We will not be retrieving data from an external source, like from a system or from the web. Those are options that you can absolutely do, but for the sake of this conversation, everything's going to be contained within our workbooks. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and select from a table or range, and you'll see that the little dashed line here is dancing, so that would indicate that the pivot table understands that that's the range of information that we want. And then another kind of important detail here is you can either create the pivot table in a net new worksheet within this workbook, or I can actually have the pivot table reside on the same worksheet, which is what I'm going to choose here. So as you can see, I'm going to locate my pivot table just starting here on L number 6. So go ahead and say OK. And with that, we are ready to begin. Okay, we have started the process of creating a pivot table. And one of the things that I like to do to start is I like to bring my data parameters, the different attributes, if you will, I like to bring them down into this first little left-hand upper box. And that is what we'll call the page filters or page views. So as an example, I'm going to pull name down and the partner name, attend, registered, partner type, and award winner. So I'm going to bring all those down. And you also may be saying, well, this block of information, it doesn't have anything numeric. There's nothing in there that's going to, there's nothing to add, if you will. So how do I actually, what am I going to use as part of my values? Okay. So I use this example very specifically because that becomes part of the confusion for some people is if I don't have actual numeric information, how can I possibly summarize it? So what you do is you basically find or identify the lowest common denominator in your data set. And in this case, it will be name, because each one of those names is going to be unique. It could be an ID number or all kinds of different things, but in this case, we'll use name. And I'm going to put that in my value field here. And you'll see that it's simply counting the number of names. Okay, so that'll essentially count the number of records that we have here. And you'll see that the total here represents 32. We have 32 records in our data set. So now the real fun begins. So with this information here, I can start to summarize based on these different attributes or values. So as an example, if I wanted to determine, well, how many partners have registered by partner type, or how many, I should say, how many partners have we invited by partner type? And you can see that we have a total of 32 partners that have been, or a total of 32 individuals that have been invited across these different partner types. Okay, so that gives us some pretty cool information. Now we could also use a slicing or filtering option here that says, well, of those 32, how many have taken the time to actually register? And we can simply select that. We'll see that 19 out of the 32 records have gone ahead and registered. So, okay, that's good. A little more than half. So I guess that's pretty good. Let's go ahead and slice this a little bit differently. And let's say, hey, we want to bring the actual name of the people that we invited, and we'll drop that down. And you'll say, that looks a little messy. Okay, that's not really looking the way I was hoping it would. And this trick here is one of the most important things that I can, impart here. This is where a lot of folks get tripped up because it's kind of a feature that's a little bit hidden, and it will help clean this up dramatically. So as an example, if I go ahead and right click on the pivot table and we go down to pivot table options and we select display, and you'll see there's this option here that says classic pivot table layout. This is super important, okay? Go ahead and click on that, say okay, and you'll say, okay, it still looks a little messy, but that's easily fixed by simply right-clicking again and removing the subtotal. Now you can see very, very clearly that, okay, Amy, who works with an ISV, has gone ahead and registered. Okay, that's good news. And it basically helps to kind of clean that information up. On my slides, number 4, I actually go through this very specific step-by-step in how you select the classic pivot table view. And again, that's something that I use quite often, because sometimes when you're pushing and pulling some of these fields in, it'll stack it in a way that makes it a little bit, in my term, a little bit messy. And so you can kind of clean this up a bit. Now let's go ahead and pull the partner type out, and let's suggest that we want to look at the partner name instead. And we want to see, of those, who are actually award winners and have not taken the time to register. Because that's kind of a bad thing, right? You've invited these folks, they're going to be award winners, you're going to put them up on stage, and they haven't even registered. So that may give us an opportunity to go out and say, hey, Charles, Holly, and Leo, we'd love to have you attend this event, and maybe encourage them or incent them differently. So we make sure that we have the right representation at the event itself. So that would be just an example of how you can kind of, again, manipulate or condition your information so it summarizes and gives you those really interesting nuggets of information and decision criteria. Okay, so that is a very kind of brief way of looking at, you know, a relatively contained set of information. Again, 32 records or 150 records or whatever, where it's, you know, not a great deal of information, but it would be hard to go ahead and look at this in a real objective way. Now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and look at what I'll call a really complex set of information. You know, we're talking about lots of different parameters here and a ton of fields or a ton of records. Okay, so as an example, if I highlight this entire block of information, we're looking at over 500,000 records that have been dumped into my Excel sheet. So most people would be, you know, screaming and saying, oh, that's too much information. I don't know where to start. This is very, very complicated. And yeah, you're right. Dealing with this amount of information is complicated, but pivot tables will make it buttery smooth. I mean, this will be super, super elegant, and you can do all kinds of cool things with this. So again, like I showed you on the prior example, if you just simply highlight the data set, so in this case, we're looking at 500 some odd thousand records, and we go to insert and then select pivot table. And again, we're going to select from a range that's been on the worksheet. But in this case, rather than have the pivot table reside on the same workbook or worksheet, I should say, I'm going to go ahead and select, I want this to be in a new workbook. All right, so I'll select the default, and when I select OK, you'll see that I now start on a fresh sheet. Okay, and this gives me kind of a little bit more of an opportunity to work with the information, and it's not cluttered by the raw data. Okay, it's just a blank sheet. And again, we're going to start in the same basic way. We're going to just start pulling some of these parameters down into the page field, and I'll just kind of randomly select a handful here. And in this case, we know that there is numeric information. Okay, this is a big report, and it includes specific metrics. Okay, so in this case, the metrics are labeled as metric number 1, metric number 2, 3, and I'll kind of leave it at that for now. So we'll start with that as an example, but I think it would also be interesting to bring down, you know, maybe we want to look at how are the regions, you know, across the world, how are they performing relative to these different metrics that we had brought into the data set. And just to kind of clean that up a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and throw in a comma so we can read it just a little bit better. Okay, so this gives us a good example or a good opportunity to see, again, how the metrics are playing out at the regional level. And you'll see up here we have a fiscal year. And in this case, we have 2 fiscal years dating back to 2016 and 2017. So I could select one of those, and that will give us the sense of, well, okay, what happened in that particular year. But let's say we wanted to actually compare year over year. Okay, well, in that case, we just simply click on the pivot table, and I'm going to bring the field, fiscal year field, over to a column. And in this case, you'll see that we are looking at 2016 here, and then 2017. And then this gives us the aggregate, or the grand total, if you will. Okay. There's another little way of rejigging this. We can actually push the summation of that up. And so then it'll do metric 1, 2016 versus 2017. So here you've got that comparison as an example. So this gives you a way of again, kind of tossing around the information in a whole bunch of different ways. And you can kind of think of it as like a Cuisinart, right? It just allows you to slice and dice and manipulate or condition your information in lots of different ways. Another example here is we've got a campaign. This may be a marketing kind of information as an example, and we want to look at like the campaign topic. And in this case, we'll select widget number 4. Well, widget number 4 performed this way across year over year. So that would be another way of looking at this information. Or let's go ahead and throw the region back up to the page field. And in this case, we'll bring the campaign topic down. And here we're looking at all of the different campaigns. And then we can start to select, well, I only want to see, well, what happened in Germany as an example. So again, I'm just trying to show you the various ways in which you can manipulate the information and really kind of make these things sing, if you will, and become more of a friend of yours as opposed to a foe. So with that, I'm going to go back to my slide deck here and just, again, this slide here is something that you can refer to. This is slide number 3, and then slide number 4 is kind of the same thing. It's just some tips and tricks on how to use that classic pivot table view. That is, like I said, it's a little bit of a hidden feature, and it really does help to clean up some of the way that data looks and how pivot tables will default. And I think there's a good reason why they default that way, but sometimes you want to go from a view that looks like this to a view that looks like that, where it's a little bit more succinct. I just believe that everybody should be able to do this, and it's just not as scary as it seems. So with that, I do really appreciate your time. I hope this was helpful. Clearly, there's lots of resources out there that would probably go in a lot more detail. But my objective was just to kind of allow you to dip the toe and feel a little bit more comfortable that, hey, maybe this isn't so insurmountable. So with that, I appreciate it very much. Thank you. And I wish you the best of luck here in your pivot table journey.